I think the experience of the 20s has shown what a free market could do to agriculture. And if the agricultural economy collapses, then the economy of the rest of the United States sooner or later will collapse. The farmers are the #1 market for the automobile industry of the United States. The automobile industry is the #1 market for steel. So if the farmer's economy continues to decline as sharply as it has in recent years, then I think you would have a recession in the rest of the country. So I think the case for the government intervention is a good one. Secondly, my objection to
President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam, and we've got our difficulties there, quite obviously.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
It is a rare individual who asks himself, what does history require of me? How is it that I can use this life, limited as it is, to benefit not only future generations, but humanity as a whole? I may be slandered, I may be attacked by my own government, I may be put in jail, I may be shot, but I will endure that. For years, the story of so-called American leaders has been one of missed chances, of failures, and buckling under pressure. Men have become as much crippled by their choice of actions as their decision not to act. And society, not seeing a solution proffered by their chosen leaders, has been enslaved by the blind adherence to those conventional beliefs that would guarantee its destruction.
Well, the thing that struck me in retrospect, because you see, Kennedy represented, it wasn't, everybody asks, why was he killed? Was it for the anti-Vietnam War policy? Was it for what he did to the Federal Reserve, the steel barons? It was all of it, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? And if you remember, the Peace Corps and the kind of overwhelming response Kennedy had gotten from a young generation in the Peace Corps, they literally couldn't keep up with the amount of people who volunteered for the Peace Corps. So it was an unleashing of unbounded optimism, right? And in a sense, that was Kennedy's crime.
In a period of 5 years, the U.S. experienced back-to-back assassinations. John F. Kennedy, who was taken out by the same international assassin ring that had attempted to kill Francis de Gaulle, then Malcolm X, then Martin Luther King, and then Robert Kennedy. Students returning to campuses in 1968 found them flooded with drugs, marijuana, LSD, and other substances to aid in creating mass psychosis. This shift, catalyzed by the CIA and aided significantly by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, fostered the growth of cultural irrationalism, taking the form of political movements like environmentalism, women's liberation, black liberation, and others associated with the New Left, itself an intrinsically fascist movement.
There was 2 successive big sit-ins. The first one I wound up leading along with other people who were working with Lynn at the time. There was Vietnam-related issues, but more especially Columbia University's taking over of a park in Harlem, in effect, to build a gym. The group that I was working in with Lynn was always bringing, or trying anyway, to bring the students to deal with larger issues of life of most people in this country rather than student issues per se. Like because a subtext issue was student deferments, that the students had been able to get out of the draft by being in college. And given the demands of manpower in the Vietnam War, those deferments were being ended. But we couldn't agree with just bringing students to fight for a student privilege. And on the contrary, we looked at the issues of, beyond just the gym in Morningside Heights, we looked at the issues of Columbia as a big landlord and a big slumlord in that whole area, which it was, it still is, as far as I know. So we were fighting for issues of, in effect, for issues of life for most people in this country, and bearing on the way that the economy had been increasingly misdirected over the recent decades, which had led to the dollar crises, to the pound and dollar crises. The thing to do would have been to bring that movement outwards, to that kind of movement outwards, to other campuses and other layers of people and students, which is what we began to do, what we attempted to do. We were successful to some extent. The students who had fled out the window of Low Library instead wanted something which is what became the later days of rage at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Expression of rage and violence, and that's what they did as what was called Hamilton II, a second Columbia sit-in, which had really no purpose but rage and violence. Around this time, they began getting some Ford Foundation funding, or at least by the time after Hamilton II's, they had some Ford Foundation funding. So they had, with that funding, a continuing organization in New York, which had like mini riots in Harlem, set fire to cars, and established itself as the Weatherman later that year, and really led the Chicago Days of Rage business. So, I mean, that's a sketch history. It does, in any case, at least to me, it indicates how that eruption out of really clinical baby boomers crippled the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party was crippled enough, really, as it was, you know, with Johnson stepping down, Kennedy's assassination, but they threw in the final poison pill with their stuff so that the Democratic constituency was splintered.
With the assassination of the next president, Robert Kennedy, and the counter-revolutionary New Left having fractured and demoralized the traditional base of the Democratic Party, the United States elected the most unlikely and unqualified man for president, Richard Nixon. Beginning publicly in 1961, Lyndon LaRouche forecast that after the middle of the 1960s, the first of a series of major monetary disturbances would result in the collapse of the existing Bretton Woods agreements. This collapse would cause increased looting of the developing sector nations and the imposition of austerity measures model upon those of fascist regimes in international economic relations and in the U.S. domestic economy. Teaching a course on economics at a number of universities, LaRouche recruited the original members of his youth movement, who were otherwise being trained to usher in the fascist economic policies of his intellectual rivals, who he called quackademics. The quackademics insisted that LaRouche's forecast was wrong, and that Bretton Woods could never collapse because of built-in stabilizers. But by August 15, 1971, it was obvious that LaRouche had been right, and every economist who refused to accept his assessment was a
Well, he was laughed at for that particular prediction. That's why it was such a vindication of him when it happened. And we had a massive wave of recruitment. Because I think one thing people knew about him more than anything else, among those who were interested at all, was that this guy's a nut because he thinks the Bretton Woods system will collapse. Whereas it's impossible because we have built-in stabilizers. That was the big thing then. In fact, when I took college economics, the whole point was the built-in stabilizers. There can never be another depression collapse because now we have the built-in stabilizers.
But how was it that LaRouche had been correct and all the others incompetent? LaRouche understood, as the putative authorities did not, that economics is existential. For each technological mode of economic activity, there is a corresponding finite resource base. In order to avoid the collapse of society that would surely follow the exhaustion of any one resource base, new technologies must be introduced. Hence, society must foster activity that will generate the scientific discoveries upon which the possibility of new, higher technologies and their associated resource bases depend. However, the putative authorities not only rejected this notion of economics, but created elaborate financial fantasies where monetary processes, like the increase in money supply, was supposedly a key indicator of economic prosperity. What those standard monetarist theories fail to take into account is the incommensurability of physical and monetary processes. With that crucial misunderstanding, disaster becomes simultaneously invisible to those within the system and inevitable for the system itself. Such was the case when LaRouche put out the challenge for any economist to debate him. 4 months after Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system, the quackademics offered up Abba Lerner, the establishment's leading Keynesian economist.
There was the famous incident in December of 1971 where Lyndon LaRouche debated Professor Abba Lerner at Queens College and shamed Lerner into admitting that he was a Shaktian. And at one point, Lerner defended himself by saying if they had listened to Schacht, Hitler would not have been necessary. And there was just a complete stunned silence in the room. I mean, this was tantamount to one of the great so-called liberal economists in New York City admitting that he was a Nazi. At that point, LaRouche was directly warned by none other than Sidney Hook, who had been the head of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And Hook told LaRouche right after that Abba Lerner debate, we have now categorized you as a potential threat. And if you ever reach the point that you begin to develop real political clout, we will destroy you.
What was this faction that was intent on bringing back the economic policies of Nazi finance minister Hjalmar Schacht only 20 years after the United States had defeated fascism?
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
On June 6, 1944, the Allied forces made their long-awaited breakthrough at Normandy. At the moment the U.S. troops landed on mainland Europe, it was known that the war would soon be won. The right-wing faction in the United States, which had originally helped to create the fascist governments of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, saw the assured victory of the Allies as their moment to move back in. Due to direct British intervention, Franklin Roosevelt's loyal partner, Henry Wallace, was denied the vice presidency, and Harry S. Truman was brought in as a running mate who would be more tolerable to the right wing. The world had been set on the track to growth and reconstruction by the 1944 Bretton Woods agreements, where it was determined that as long as the United States dollar was widely issued and widely used as credit for industrial, agricultural, and related productive purposes, it was as good as gold. Under those circumstances of vast credit expansion, the world was on the track to reconstruction in a post-war, post-colonial period. But it was no sooner than Roosevelt had died that the Bretton Woods system came under attack. His intention for productive credit generation was not realized, and the dollar was overstretched to supplement a growing services economy, producing a burgeoning consumer debt bubble in the United States. Under these conditions, the developing sector was not industrialized. Instead of gaining economic and political independence, they were recolonized under the leadership of Harry Truman. The most severe attack against the Bretton Woods system took place following the 1964 election of the Harold Wilson government. The British pound sterling, the currency of colonial trade, had been made the second international reserve currency, in spite of the fact that it was always considered to be the sick man of the fixed exchange rate system. In 1967, when the pound was in a free fall, Wilson appealed to the managing director of the IMF, who desperately wanted to end Roosevelt's Bretton Woods system, and he requested $3 billion to ostensibly save the British pound. When the IMF director refused the loan, Britain forced a 14% devaluation of their pound and triggered an international liquidation of dollar holdings for gold. This set off a chain reaction of monetary crises throughout the late 1960s, culminating in the 1968 Monetary Conference, where the fight erupted between the British, who argued that the crises were caused by the Bretton Woods system, and the faction typified by France's Charles de Gaulle, who blamed these crises on speculation and currency devaluation. This push from London to discredit and destroy Roosevelt's Bretton Woods system and replace it with a globalized financial empire coincided with the growing Fabian faction in foreign policy associated with the tradition of H.G. Wells. This grouping, around London and Wall Street particularly, sought to incorporate the United States as a junior partner in a worldwide British empire to rule as the only nuclear-armed power on the planet, threatening annihilation to any nation that would not submit. This doctrine passed from Wells, a fascist, to his protege Bertrand Russell, who, only days after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, began encouraging the United States to launch preventive nuclear war against the Soviet Union. However, in 1949, when the Soviets first tested their atom bomb, the plan changed for Russell and his crowd. Following the death of Stalin, Russell invited Nikita Khrushchev to a conference of the Association of Parliamentarians for World Government. Khrushchev accepted the invitation, indicating that the post-Stalin Soviet Union was preparing to orient toward British imperialism, specifically a nuclear-armed world government. This favorable meeting of the Parliamentarians for World Government opened the door to the later 1958 Pugwash Conference, where Russell's protege, Leo Szilard, first announced the doctrine which would determine Cold War international relations: The doctrine was known as mutually assured destruction, or just plain mad. It was out of this right-wing grouping that the Harvard professor Henry Kissinger broke onto the scene, authoring the 1958 Pugwash-Backwash, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. Kissinger argued that the threat of an all-out nuclear war was implausible, and that it were best for the United States to only engage in limited irregular warfare and limited nuclear warfare with Soviet allies. Kissinger later led David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission during the Carter administration. The Trilateral Commission was established in 1973 to ensure that the industrial nations who had fought to preserve the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system would be silenced and induced to adopt post-industrial policies. Similarly, the rest of the world would be forced into a similar paradigm of Malthusian, zero technological growth to be imposed from a supranational power like NATO, making nations in the Third World, especially those under Soviet watch, highly contested.
Mortgages and loans has suffered not only from the appearance
Paul Volcker was key to promoting the agenda of the Trilateral Commission, not only by destroying the U.S. domestic economy by raising interest rates beyond 20%, restricting credit to farmers and small industry, but with the more insidious implications of trapping vital Soviet allies in debt to the Western financial establishment, a cause for serious frictions in U.S.-Soviet strategic relations.
You know, so we're back to the debt farming. And you just keep building up the debt greater and greater and greater, and then you use that debt to control companies, to control the economy, to control the government, which is what we see today. So this is the process of the 1980s.
Already foreboding the collapse of their economy, the Soviet Union had inherent problems in their notion of economic value and wealth. In particular, problems which can be seen in the very unfortunate influence of British economics. The Warsaw Pact nations, Poland in particular, were expected to produce for the Soviet military, which had access to the most groundbreaking technologies, but virtually no integration of those capabilities into the civilian sector. Without further investments into the civilian economy, transportation, power, and agriculture, the Warsaw Pact nations fell increasingly into poverty, having their aging industrial and agricultural bases eaten away without being replenished with new capital investments. Under these conditions, also known as primitive accumulation, certain nations in the East turned to the Western banking establishment to get hooked on U.S. debt. The broader Trilateral Commission plan to snatch Soviet allies spelled out a dangerous prelude to World War III.
This is Lyndon LaRouche, presidential candidate of the U.S. Labor Party, the third candidate in this election. Tonight, I want to speak to you not only on behalf of the Labor Party, but on the behalf of many concerned Republicans, many concerned Democrats, and many concerned European leaders. We are convinced, not only me, my party, but key Republicans, key Democrats, key leaders in Europe, key leaders of the Third World, that the election of Jimmy Carter to President of the United States on November 2nd would mean that the United States was, to all intents and purposes, irreversibly committed to thermonuclear war no later than the summer of 1977.
To counter the influence of the Trilateral Commission's candidates, Mondale and Carter, LaRouche ran on the Labor Party ticket, proposing the International Development Bank to allow the utterance of credit for priority regional economic programs, particularly to encourage stability in the Middle East. Sometimes, what is most important in history is what does not happen.
Many of these proposals will be unpopular. some will cause you to put up with inconveniences and to make sacrifices.
The 1976 exposure of Brzezinski, Kissinger, and Carter's program for a nuclear showdown opened up the sensitive, patriotic layers in the military, intelligence, and government institutions to Lyndon LaRouche. During those perilous years of the Carter administration, LaRouche served as an unofficial channel of communication between elements inside the official U.S. intelligence establishment and their Soviet counterparts. This was part of a fail-safe system built up to minimize the danger of some misunderstanding triggering a strategic confrontation. By 1977, LaRouche and key elements of the scientific community launched the Fusion Energy Foundation, which quickly became the most prominent organization promoting nuclear fusion, as well as a venue for further collaboration and development of the core concept of LaRouche's economic ideas. The Fusion Energy Foundation, led by LaRouche, produced a report on nuclear beam defense which circulated in military intelligence circles.
The method we must use is called layered strategic ballistic missile defense. The first line of defense is beam weapons, which are assigned to destroy Soviet missiles at the moment those missiles are launched. The second line of defense is beam weapons assigned to destroy Soviet missiles in those missiles' highly vulnerable boost phase. The third line of defense is beam weapons assigned to hit repeatedly at all Soviet missiles and deployed warheads in the stratosphere. The fourth line of defense includes special effects bombs, which detonate above the level of our atmosphere, which will cause incoming warheads to tumble and therefore to burn up as they enter the atmosphere. The fifth line of defense is ground-based beam weapon systems assigned to destroy warheads as they descend through the atmosphere. The final line of defense includes throwing everything, including the kitchen sink if need be, to destroy a warhead before it reaches its target.
Through this, LaRouche exposed the truth of the Cold War and confronted the Russellite crowd with an existential threat. Nations could now bring an end to the insane international policy doctrine of MAD by forming new parameters for cooperation, working together to develop new physical principle technologies for defense against ballistic missiles, and spreading those technologies throughout the civilian sector for the purpose of national development. In light of his growing influence, there was a widespread assumption that if LaRouche were heavily attacked and slandered, he could be contained and would be incapable of influencing the policy of the U.S. government or any other. But that assumption was proven wrong, and the greatest fears of LaRouche's enemies were confirmed.
So we had a meeting with all these candidates. This is 1980. And Reagan was there and other candidates. And I was sitting next. We were seated in alphabetical order by surname. So Reagan was on the extreme left, and I was seated next to him. So we got into a conversation, and this became quite notable. Now, my adversary, one of the key adversaries of me in this whole business was, who made himself my adversary, was George W. Bush, H.W. Bush. My presence got Bush all upset. And Bush began to do foolish things, and he lost a debate with Reagan in Manchester. And then he really lost it in Nashua. This is all on record. It's all available. And where he said, I'm paying for this microphone. Reagan did. And Reagan really was a runaway nominee for the Republican convention at that point on.
Beginning in early 1981, LaRouche and his associates were brought into meetings with members of Reagan's National Security Council. After opening a dialogue with the Reagan administration, LaRouche was contacted by Soviet representatives at the UN, who asked to hear his assessment of the new Reagan administration. His collaboration with Reagan's National Security Council and certain elements in the Soviet Union provided the background for Reagan's request that LaRouche take part in an official back channel with Soviet representatives to manage increasingly tense relations. 2 months later, LaRouche was meeting with the Soviet embassy official in Washington, Yevgeny Shershnev. However, Certain elements in the Reagan administration, who were pushing the endgame doctrine of the Trilateral Commission and MAD, saw LaRouche's collaboration with the new president as a considerable threat. As soon as this back channel was opened, Henry Kissinger personally contacted FBI Director William Webster and Roy Godson of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, requesting that they target Lyndon LaRouche. At the same time Kissinger was initiating this frame-up, Lyndon LaRouche was invited to Mexico to meet with President José López Portillo. López Portillo asked LaRouche what he thought the Wall Street bankers and others intended for Mexico. LaRouche replied that they intended to destroy Mexico through financial warfare. By the fall, that forecast was in the process of being fully borne out. The nationalist circles around President López Portillo requested a policy to address this crisis, to which LaRouche responded by publishing the book-length report Operation Juarez in August 1982, calling for the reorganization of the pooled debts of South and Central America as a source of long-term, low-interest credit for great infrastructure and high-technology projects. The adoption of LaRouche's proposal by President López Portillo stunned the financial establishment. According to Kissinger collaborator Leo Chern, who chaired the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board on Third World Debt, Portillo's actions sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C.
The development of strategic ballistic missile defense using laser weapons.
By December 22, 1982, LaRouche issued a warning to the Soviets, encouraging them to accept the proposal for beam weapons. Otherwise, those underlying problems of the Soviet economy would bring their system down. Despite his warning, the Soviets continued an intensive military buildup under Premier Andropov, who was convinced that his political influence was bounded within the rules of a multipolar world system. Out of fear of the consequences of breaking with that framework in favor of the economic and strategic cooperation which Reagan and LaRouche had proposed, Andropov rejected the offer, and when he died in February 1984, his successor Gorbachev assumed the same framework and pushed the Soviet economy beyond its already overstretched limits in an attempt to eliminate the Western Empire with a thermonuclear first strike before they developed the proposed defense system. Shershnev reported back to LaRouche, saying that he had been instructed from the highest levels to say that Moscow had agreed that the beam weapon proposal was feasible, but would reject it out of hand because the Soviet Union would be unable to compete with the United States under conditions of a revived U.S. economy. LaRouche once again warned his Soviet counterpart that if they were to reject Reagan's forthcoming offer and go ahead with a military surge to achieve first strike capability, the Soviet Union would collapse in about 5 years. On March 23, 1983, Reagan was scheduled to deliver a nationally televised address on the Soviet military buildup. There were two proposals for the speech that Reagan delivered. One had a section where Reagan was going to announce LaRouche's program, which he called the Strategic Defense Initiative. James Baker III encouraged Reagan to use the second version of the speech, which omitted LaRouche's proposal.
Lyndon LaRouche understood that this was a decision made by the president over and against the recommendations of virtually all of his top advisors. The only member of the Reagan team at the White House or in the cabinet who was really 100% with him on the SDI proposal was Judge William Clark, who was the National Security Advisor. The White House Chief of Staff was James Baker III. He was opposed. The Secretary of State was George Shultz. He was opposed. Even Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was not a big supporter of the SDI proposal. We later found out that right up until the very last moment, literally before the TV cameras turned on and President Reagan delivered the address, there were attempts by James Baker III, the White House Chief of Staff, to strip that portion out of the president's speech. And even though there had been a briefing on the speech given to reporters earlier in the day, if President Reagan had not gone on national television and made that announcement in the way that he did, it would not have happened.
I clearly recognize that defensive systems have limitations and raise certain problems and ambiguities. If paired with offensive systems, they can be viewed as fostering an aggressive policy, and no one wants that. But with these considerations firmly in mind, I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
The announcement by President Reagan caught the world completely by surprise. In fact, probably the only people on the planet who were not shocked and completely taken off guard by what Reagan did was Lyndon LaRouche and even just a handful of others inside the LaRouche organization who had been directly involved in the back-channel work between the Reagan administration and the Soviet government, and who therefore had some appreciation of just how serious the White House, the president himself, was about the idea of bringing an end to this era of thermonuclear terror.
That their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies.
Taking up the challenge to reduce the need for nuclear arsenals, President Ronald Reagan proposed in 1983 that the United States...
The following day, each and every opponent of LaRouche was shocked. The media had no clue how to report the day's top development, Reagan's call for an end to mutually assured destruction. All over the world, LaRouche's policies for international development were spreading. In the face of worsening financial and strategic breakdowns, LaRouche's unique ability to forecast and propose solutions to those crises had reached the point at which the widespread adoption of his policies would have meant the absolute end to any relics of an imperial or colonial system. 1 month to the day after Reagan announced to the world that he was going with Lyndon LaRouche's policy, Wall Street broker John Train launched a series of meetings involving journalists and government officials, including officials of the National Security Council who had opposed the SDI, to plan a coordinated media assault to get LaRouche. Train began his career in the 1950s working for the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom. In the period following the establishment of the Train Salon, there were no independent journalists covering LaRouche. The press assaults were entirely orchestrated from the top down in collaboration with some of the highest levels of the government. The Soviet press called for Lyndon LaRouche to be investigated. They called for him to be prosecuted. They accused him of killing the Swedish Prime Minister. They said he would be a cause for war.
The Soviets went so far as to produce a prime-time docudrama accusing LaRouche.
Европейской рабочей партии уже сила. Более 10 стран, штаб-квартира в США. Точная цель – борьба с коммунизмом. Борясь с красными, они не забывают и о розовых. Послушайте, что говорит их лидер Larouche.
So Gorbachev and Soviet military leaders called for a summit in Reykjavik, Iceland, intending to finally break President Reagan away from LaRouche and force him to abandon the SDI. The forces in the United States and the Soviet Union grew increasingly desperate, and they were willing to risk much to bring down LaRouche. In the United States, LaRouche was not only a major factor in the White House, but his associates were spreading his ideas in elections across the country. In only 7 months, John Train's press assault pumped out over 15,000 slander articles. Yet LaRouche's associates were running for office and winning more and more votes. 60 articles a day, 7 days a week, pumped through the press. But the American people were not breaking with LaRouche, and the president was not breaking with LaRouche either. One day before the Reykjavik summit, on October 6, 1986, the sleepy farm town of Leesburg, Virginia, was invaded by a federal task force of hundreds. Lyndon LaRouche's campaign offices were raided, and his home was surrounded by over 400 federal, state, and local police personnel with aircraft and armored vehicles. The intention was not for LaRouche to be peacefully turned over to the authorities, nor was it to have a long trial and sentencing. The intention was to stop his influence through assassination.
Clearly, President Reagan did not want anything to do with a government political assassination conducted by his own government. So somewhere within the White House and those intelligence circles, there was a fight pushing back against those led by people like Henry Kissinger, who wanted the outcome of the October 1986 raids to be the murder of Lyndon LaRouche and God knows how many other of his colleagues.
The legal frame-up of Lyndon LaRouche reached the boiling point in early 1987, when the federal government forced LaRouche's publishing companies into involuntary bankruptcy, an unprecedented act in American history, declared illegal only 2 years later. 1 month after the Department of Justice bankrupted, seized, and liquidated LaRouche's major publications, LaRouche warned of the outbreak of a major collapse in mid-October. As these forecasts played out, LaRouche fought the Department of Justice frame-up to ensure his availability to America, Russia, and the rest of the world during the looming crisis of 1989.
In October of 1988, LaRouche received permission to travel to West Germany. The Berlin Wall had not yet come down. That would occur a little over a year later. But LaRouche went to Berlin to make yet one final offer to the Soviet Union that would have perhaps even at that late date opened the prospect of the Soviet Union surviving, but going through a peaceful transformation. LaRouche gave a press conference at the Kempinski Hotel in West Berlin, literally in the shadow of the Brandenburg Gate, which separated East and West Berlin.
Many today will agree that the time has come for early steps toward the reunification of Germany, with the obvious prospect that Berlin might resume its role as the nation's capital. For the United States, as for Germans and Europe generally, the question is, will this reunification process be brought about by assimilating the Federal Republic into the East Bloc's economy or economic range of influence, or can it be accomplished in a different way? In other words, is a united Germany to come into being as a part of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, as President de Gaulle proposed, or as Mr. Gorbachev has desired, a Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic?
LaRouche, as part of a Food for Peace initiative that he was leading in the fall of 1988, went to Berlin and gave a final offer and a final warning to the Soviet Union that if they were not willing to accept this latest offer of cooperation from the West to help revive the economy of Poland that was collapsing at the time, and to use this as another opportunity to forge lines of cooperation rather than conflict between the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact on the one side and the US and Europe and NATO on the other, then this would merely accelerate the collapse of the Soviet Union.
This lesson, despite all attempts at structural reform, and despite any amount of credit supplied by the foolish West, the Soviet bloc economy as a whole has reached the critical point. At its present time, in its present form, it will continue to slide downhill from here on
even if the present worldwide food crisis had not come into being.
Only days after his final warning to the Soviet Union, LaRouche and several of his associates were indicted in Alexandria, Virginia, on fraudulent charges. Several months earlier, a jury was called in Boston, but they were dismissed after a mistrial. That jury later reported at a press conference that they could find no evidence to convict LaRouche, only evidence that the government intended to frame him. LaRouche and his associates were indicted again and called to trial at the U.S. District Court in Alexandria, Virginia, known as the Rocket Docket, for its speedy convictions and forced guilty pleas. Key evidence was barred from the trial under special orders from Richard Nixon's specially appointed federal judge, Albert V. Bryan, Jr. And in just 2 months, from indictment to trial to conviction, LaRouche was railroaded into prison. On December 16, 1988, Lyndon LaRouche was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with several of his associates facing similar and worse sentencing. As LaRouche and his associates watched from prison, the Cold War era came to an end with the Soviet economy's collapse, just as he had forecast in 1983. The leaders of the world were now presented with a choice as to what new paradigm would shape the destiny of their nations. Unfortunately, the world did not return to the optimism of John F. Kennedy. The new Bush administration rejected LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative. The British government moved to stifle the development of a reunified Germany through assassination and coercion. And the former Soviet bloc was asset-stripped to feed the failing economies in the West and usher in the era of globalization. A great moment had found a little people.
Therefore, the issue is the nature of man, the nature of the human individual. Is the human individual an animal who simply has dog-like characteristics or cow-like characteristics, certain species characteristics given by a biological endowment? Or is mankind the human mind? Is mankind the creative being that Zeus hated? The individual who can create, discover universal physical principles and apply the knowledge of these principles to change the condition of life of humanity and to conquer man's problems as a whole. Is the individual sacred? Is the individual human being different than a mere animal?